Elderly woman shouts, "Give me back my daughter," to millionaire during interview. The pristine glass walls of London's financial district reflected the morning sun, casting a golden glow over the bustling streets below. Outside the towering headquarters of Pharmatech Industries, television crews jostled for position as they prepared for a live interview with Britain's most celebrated business tycoon, Alexander Blackwood. At 65, Blackwood cut an imposing figure in his bespoke Savile Row suit. His silver hair and stern features had graced countless magazine covers, and his recent $2.3 billion acquisition of a rival pharmaceutical company had only heightened media interest in the self-made billionaire. 3 minutes to air, called out Sarah Chen, the lead reporter from Global News Network. She adjusted her blazer and checked her reflection in her phone's screen. Landing an exclusive interview with Blackwood was a career-defining moment, and she intended to make the most of it. Blackwood stood perfectly still as a makeup artist made final touches to his appearance. His eyes remained fixed on the financial data scrolling across his mobile phone. The stock market had responded favorably to his latest acquisition, pushing Pharmatech's shares to an all-time high. "Mr. Blackwood," his assistant whispered, "the board members are watching the broadcast from Tokyo. They've sent their congratulations on the merger." He nodded curtly, slipping his phone into his pocket. Success had always been his most faithful companion, ever since he'd launched his first pharmacy in a shabby London suburb 30 years ago. Now, with over 3,000 stores across Europe and Asia, Pharmatech Industries had revolutionized the pharmaceutical retail industry. The camera operator counted down with his fingers. Sarah Chen flashed her practiced smile as the red light blinked on. "Good morning, Britain. I'm standing here with Alexander Blackwood, CEO of Pharmatech Industries, who has just completed the largest pharmaceutical acquisition in European history. Mr. Blackwood, this merger has been described as aggressive by some industry analysts. How would you respond to those criticisms?" Blackwood's thin lips curved into a practiced smile. "Innovation requires bold action, Sarah. When I started this company, I vowed to make quality healthcare accessible to everyone. This merger brings us closer to that vision." A small crowd had gathered behind the news crew, mostly consisting of office workers and tourists eager to catch a glimpse of the famous billionaire. But among them, an elderly woman with a wooden cane pushed forward, her weathered face contorted with emotion. "You're lying." The shrill voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "You never cared about making healthcare accessible." The camera swiveled toward the commotion. Margaret Walsh, 70 years old, stood trembling at the edge of the crowd. Her grey hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her clothes, though clean and pressed, spoke of modest means. "You destroyed my business," she continued, her voice carrying across the plaza. "You destroyed my family. Where is my daughter?" Security personnel moved toward her, but Blackwood raised his hand, stopping them. His face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or concern. Sarah Chen, seizing the opportunity for unscripted drama, thrust her microphone toward Margaret. "Ma'am, what are you saying about Mr. Blackwood?" Margaret pulled a worn leather folder from her bag, her hand shaking as she opened it. "I owned Walsh Family Pharmacies. We had 6 stores across London. Stores my father started after the war, then he came along." She pointed at Blackwood. "He systematically destroyed us. He blocked our suppliers, manipulated our contracts, undercut our prices until we had nothing left." The crowd murmured. Phones appeared, recording the confrontation. Blackwood's assistant was frantically typing on her tablet, likely calling in the PR team. 25 years ago," Margaret continued, her voice breaking, "I had to give up my little girl for adoption. She was only 3. I couldn't afford to keep her. Do you know what that feels like, Mr. Blackwood? To have everything taken from you." The morning sun seemed to dim as clouds gathered overhead. Sarah Chen looked between Margaret and Blackwood, her professional demeanor momentarily forgotten in the face of raw human emotion. Blackwood straightened his tie, his composure unwavering. "Ms. Walsh, these are serious allegations. I suggest we discuss this in a more appropriate venue, with our legal teams present." But Margaret wasn't finished. She opened her folder wider, revealing yellowed documents and newspaper clippings. "I've kept everything. Every document, every letter, every piece of evidence showing how you systematically targeted family businesses like mine. And I'm not the only one. There are others. The live broadcast continued, capturing every word. Viewers across Britain watched as the carefully orchestrated interview transformed into something entirely unexpected. In offices, homes, and coffee shops, people leaned closer to their screens, witnessing the moment when a carefully constructed facade began to crack. Within hours, the confrontation outside pharma-tech industries had gone viral. Social media buzzed with clips of Margaret Walsh's emotional accusation, and Blackwood truth began trending nationwide. In pharma-tech's executive offices, Victoria Pearce watched the footage for the third time, her manicured nails drumming against her desk. At 28, Victoria had risen to become the youngest chief strategy officer in pharma-tech's history. She'd earned her position through a combination of brilliant business acumen and unwavering loyalty to Alexander Blackwood, who had become something of a mentor to her. The sight of the elderly woman's accusations stirred something uncomfortable in her chest. "Ms. Pearce," her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, "Mr. Blackwood would like to see you immediately." Victoria smoothed her skirt and headed to the top floor. The corridor leading to Blackwood's office seemed longer than usual, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of London's skyline. She found him standing at the window, his back to the door. "Victoria," he said without turning, "I need you to handle this situation." She stepped into the room, her heels silent on the thick carpet. "Of course, sir. I've already contacted our PR team and legal is preparing a statement." "No." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I need you to handle this personally. That woman, Margaret Walsh, she needs to be persuaded to retract her statements." Victoria nodded, already formulating strategies. "I'll arrange a meeting with her legal representatives." "You don't understand," Blackwood interrupted. "This is delicate. There are complications." He picked up a file from his desk and handed it to her. "Read this first." As Victoria opened the file, her hands began to tremble. The first page was a birth certificate, followed by adoption papers. Her adoption papers, the same ones she'd seen only once before, when her adoptive parents had shown them to her on her 18th birthday. "I don't understand," she whispered. But deep down, she did. The dates matched. The locations matched. Margaret Walsh's daughter, the 3-year-old girl given up for adoption 25 years ago, was her. Blackwood's voice softened, taking on an almost paternal tone. "I've always looked out for you, Victoria, even before you knew who I was. When I learned that Walsh's daughter had been put up for adoption, I made sure you were placed with the right family, a family that could give you every opportunity." Victoria sank into a chair, her professional composure cracking. Memories flooded her mind. Her comfortable childhood in Switzerland, the best schools, her fast-tracked career at pharma-tech. Had none of it been coincidence? "Why?" she managed to ask. "Because I saw potential in you. The same drive I had, the same hunger for success." Blackwood sat behind his desk. "Everything I've done has been to build something greater than myself. Yes, I've made difficult decisions. Yes, I've been ruthless when necessary. But look at what we've achieved. Look at what you've achieved." Outside the office, phones rang and employees hurried through their daily routines, unaware of the personal drama unfolding behind the frosted glass doors. Victoria stared at her reflection in the window, searching for any resemblance to the woman who had stood trembling with emotion just hours before. "The media is digging," Blackwood continued. "They'll find the connection eventually. We need to control this narrative. And you, Victoria, are the key to that control." She looked up sharply. "You want me to discredit her, my own mother? I want you to protect everything we've built, everything you've built." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Think carefully about where your loyalty lies. That woman gave you up. I gave you everything." Victoria's phone buzzed. Another news alert. Someone had leaked internal pharma-tech documents supporting Margaret Walsh's claims. The hashtag had spread internationally. Former employees were coming forward with their own stories. "Take the weekend," Blackwood said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. "Think about what's at stake. But remember, Victoria, in business, as in life, we can't let sentiment cloud our judgment." She left his office in a daze, the file clutched to her chest. As she walked back to her office, employees glanced at her curiously. Did they know? Had they guessed? The sleek corporate environment that had always felt like home suddenly seemed alien and cold. In her office, Victoria closed the blinds and sank into her chair. On her computer screen, Margaret Walsh's face stared back at her from a dozen news websites. She touched the image, tracing the lines of the woman's face. Then she opened her desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph, the only link to her life before adoption, showing a smiling toddler in a flowered dress. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across her office. Victoria Pierce, the rising star of pharma-tech industries, sat alone with two versions of her past, facing an impossible choice about her future. In her modest flat in South London, Margaret Walsh sat surrounded by old photographs and newspaper clippings spread across her kitchen table. The evening news played quietly on the television, showing yet another replay of her confrontation with Alexander Blackwood. Her tea had gone cold. Forgotten amid the flood of memories the document stirred. A gentle knock at the door startled her. Opening it, she found Sarah Chen, the reporter from the morning's broadcast, standing in the hallway. "Mrs. Walsh," Sarah said softly, "I apologize for coming unannounced, but I believe there's more to your story that needs to be told." Margaret hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. The small living room was neat but worn, with faded wallpaper and carefully mended furniture. On the walls hung photographs of the old Walsh family pharmacies, smiling staff, Christmas parties, community events. "I've been doing some research," Sarah continued, pulling out her tablet. "Your family's pharmacies weren't the only ones affected by pharma-tech's expansion. I've found similar patterns across the country." She showed Margaret a map dotted with red markers, each representing a family business that had collapsed during pharma-tech's rise. The pattern was clear: systematic targeting of successful local pharmacies, particularly those in affluent areas or near hospitals. "There's someone you should meet," Sarah said, scrolling through her contacts. "James Richardson, former head of acquisitions at Pharmatech. He left the company 15 years ago and has agreed to talk." The following morning, in a quiet cafe in Greenwich, James Richardson nervously stirred his coffee. At 60, he carried the weight of his past decisions in the slump of his shoulders and the tremor in his hands. "I was there when it all started," he began, glancing between Margaret and Sarah. Blackwood had a formula. He'd identify successful family businesses, then launch aggressive expansion campaigns in their areas. But it wasn't just competition. It was sabotage. James pulled out an old leather notebook. "I kept records of everything. The meetings where we planned how to pressure suppliers into exclusive contracts, the strategies to manipulate local property prices, the smear campaigns against family businesses that refused to sell." Margaret's hands shook as she read through James's notes. There it was in black and white, the deliberate strategy that had destroyed her life, written in corporate language that masked its human cost. "But why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why target us specifically?" James leaned back, his expression haunted. Blackwood had a theory. He believed that family businesses were inherently weak because they put people before profits. He saw himself as improving the industry by removing what he called sentimental operators. Sarah recorded everything, her journalistic instincts telling her this was bigger than one woman's story. This was about the human cost of unchecked corporate power. "There's something else," James added, hesitating. "Something about your daughter, Mrs. Walsh." Margaret's head snapped up. "Victoria? Did you know her?" "Not directly, no. But I was in the meeting when Blackwood learned she'd been put up for adoption. He became too obsessed with the idea of taking her in, shaping her into his corporate ideology. It was like he wanted to prove that his way was superior, that he could turn even your daughter into someone who would choose profit over family." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. All these years, she'd imagined her daughter growing up in a loving family, not as part of some cruel experiment in corporate manipulation. "I have to find her," Margaret said firmly. "I have to tell her the truth." "She's closer than you think," Sarah interjected, pulling up a photograph on her tablet. "Victoria Pierce, Pharmatech's Chief Strategy Officer. I've been comparing dates and records. It's her, Mrs. Walsh." "It's your daughter." Margaret stared at the photograph of the elegant young woman in a business suit, addressing a corporate conference. She'd seen her on television, of course, but had never made the connection. Now, looking at Victoria's face, she could see echoes of her baby girl. The same determined set of the jaw, the same intense eyes. "She doesn't know, does she?" Margaret whispered. "About any of this?" "No," James confirmed. Blackwood made sure she was raised to embrace his values. She's his proudest achievement, proof in his mind that his philosophy works. As the afternoon light faded, the three of them sat in the quiet cafe, surrounded by the weight of revelations. Sarah's recorder captured every word, as James continued to share documents and memories, each one adding another layer to the story of corporate manipulation and personal loss. Margaret traced her finger over Victoria's photograph, her heart aching with a mixture of joy at finally finding her daughter and sorrow at the life she'd been engineered to lead. "She deserves to know the truth," she said firmly. "Not just about me, but about everything." Victoria spent the weekend in her penthouse apartment, surrounded by research. She'd pulled every file she could find about Pharmatech's early years, every news article about Walsh family pharmacies, and every scrap of information about her adoption. The more she uncovered, the more her carefully constructed world began to crumble. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from Blackwood, each one more insistent than the last. The latest read, "Board meeting tomorrow. They need reassurance. They need to see us united." She ignored it, focusing instead on an old photograph she'd found online, the grand opening of the first Walsh family pharmacy in 1948. Margaret stood there as a young girl, beside her father, both beaming with pride. Victoria couldn't help but notice she had her grandfather's smile. A notification popped up on her laptop. Someone had leaked internal emails from Pharmatech's early days. Her hands trembled as she read through them. They detailed explicit strategies for targeting family businesses, including Walsh pharmacies. One email from Blackwood stood out. "These sentimental fools don't understand. Business is warfare. We're not just taking their market share, we're liberating the industry from outdated family values." The intercom buzzed, startling her. "Miss Pierce, there's a Sarah Chen here to see you. She says it's urgent." Victoria hesitated. The reporter's presence at this moment couldn't be coincidence. "Send her up." Sarah arrived with a leather briefcase and a determined expression. "Thank you for seeing me, Miss Pierce. I have something you need to see." Over the next hour, Sarah laid out everything she'd uncovered: James Richardson's testimony, the systematic targeting of family businesses, and most importantly, Blackwood's deliberate manipulation of Victoria's adoption and career. "He didn't just take you in," Sarah explained gently. "He engineered your entire life to prove a point. Every school choice, every career move, it was all carefully orchestrated." Victoria stood by the window, her reflection ghostly in the darkening glass. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you deserve to know the truth, and because you're the only one who can make this right." A familiar voice cut through the room. "That's quite enough, Miss Chen." Alexander Blackwood stood in the doorway, his expression cold. "I believe this meeting is over." Sarah gathered her materials calmly. "Everything I've told Miss Pierce is documented, Mr. Blackwood. The story runs tomorrow." After she left, silence filled the apartment. Victoria turned to face her mentor, seeing him clearly for the first time. "Did you orchestrate everything, my whole life?" "I gave you opportunities," Blackwood replied, moving to pour himself a drink. "Look at what you've become. Would you have achieved all this if you'd stayed with her? Living above a tiny pharmacy, counting pennies? That wasn't your choice to make. Everything I've done has been for the greater good. Your mother? She was weak. She let sentiment cloud her judgment. But you're different. You understand what it takes to succeed." Victoria picked up a framed photograph from her desk, her receiving the Employee of the Year award, Blackwood's arm around her shoulders. "I thought I earned all of this. I thought you saw something special in me." "I did. I saw myself, someone willing to do whatever it takes to win." He stepped closer. "Don't let them poison you with their emotional manipulation. You're better than that." Victoria's phone buzzed again. Another news alert. Former Pharmatech employees were organizing a press conference, promising more revelations. The hashtag #MarBlackwoodTruth had reached millions of impressions. "The board meeting tomorrow," Blackwood continued, his voice hardening. "You need to stand with me. Show them that these accusations are baseless. Your presence, your success, is my greatest defense." She looked at him, this man who had shaped her life without her knowledge or consent. "And if I don't?" His smile was cold. "Then everything you've worked for, everything you've achieved, disappears. Do you really want to throw it all away for a woman who gave you up? Who chose her failing business over you? The words hung in the air between them. Outside, London's lights twinkled in the gathering dusk. Somewhere out there, Margaret Walsh was probably sitting in her flat, surrounded by memories of a life that had been deliberately destroyed. Victoria's hand closed around the adoption papers on her desk. 25 years of carefully constructed identity began to shift, like sand in an hourglass. Tomorrow's board meeting loomed ahead, a moment of choice that would define not just her future, but her understanding of who she truly was. The Pharmatech boardroom hummed with tension on Monday morning. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the concerned faces of board members who had flown in from across Europe for this emergency meeting. Victoria sat at her usual place, 2 seats down from Blackwood, her expression carefully neutral. "The market is responding to these allegations," Charles Henderson, the chief financial officer, reported grimly. "Our stock has dropped 15% since Friday's broadcast. Major investors are demanding answers." Blackwood remained unruffled, his silver hair catching the morning light. "These are baseless accusations from disgruntled former business owners who couldn't adapt to market changes. Victoria, please share our response strategy." All eyes turned to her. Victoria stood slowly, her presentation ready on the screen behind her. But as she looked at the familiar faces around the table, something shifted inside her. Years of board meetings, strategic planning sessions, and corporate victories suddenly felt hollow. "Mr. Blackwood is right," she began, her voice steady. "These are indeed accusations from former business owners. However," she paused, her heart pounding, "they're not baseless." The room fell silent. Blackwood's knuckles whitened around his pen. "I've spent the weekend reviewing historical documents and internal communications," Victoria continued. "The evidence shows a systematic campaign to destroy family-owned pharmacies through predatory practices, manipulation of suppliers, and deliberate market interference." She clicked through slides showing emails, contracts, and financial records. This wasn't competition. It was calculated destruction of local businesses. "And I can verify these practices personally because," she took a deep breath, "I am Margaret Walsh's daughter." The boardroom erupted in chaos. Board members talked over each other, demanding explanations. Blackwood sat eerily still, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Furthermore," Victoria's voice cut through the noise, "I've discovered that my entire career, my adoption, my education, all of it was orchestrated by Mr. Blackwood as part of his campaign to prove his business philosophy superior to family-owned enterprises." "That's enough!" Blackwood stood abruptly. "Ms. Pierce is clearly experiencing emotional distress. I move to adjourn this meeting." "Actually," came a voice from the doorway, "I think we should hear more." Sarah Chen stood there with a camera crew, flanked by James Richardson and several former Pharmatech executives. The public deserves to know the truth. Security moved to intercept them, but Victoria raised her hand. "I invited them. As Chief Strategy Officer, I have that authority, and I believe transparency is our best strategy now." Over the next hour, the story unfolded in front of rolling cameras. James Richardson presented his detailed records of corporate sabotage. Former executives confirmed years of systematic targeting of family businesses. Victoria shared her personal discovery and the documentation of how her life had been manipulated. Blackwood sat in silence, his empire crumbling around him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge of desperation. "Everything I did was necessary. You don't understand what it takes to build something of this magnitude. I came from nothing, the son of a street sweeper. I watched my father work himself into exhaustion for pennies because he believed in the dignity of honest work. But I learned the truth. In this world, you either take control or you become a victim of those who do." "No," Victoria countered, her voice firm. "You became what you claimed to fight against. You didn't liberate the industry. You corrupted it. You didn't help me. You used me to validate your own choices." The board members exchanged glances. The chairman cleared his throat. "I believe we need to call for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current leadership." As the voting began, Victoria gathered her belongings. Her hands trembled as she packed up her office, but her steps were steady as she walked through the building one last time. Employees watched in silence as she crossed the lobby, many already watching the live news coverage on their phones. Outside, the morning had turned grey, a light rain falling over London. Victoria found Margaret waiting under an umbrella, uncertain but present. Their eyes met, decades of loss and possibility hanging between them. "I don't know how to be your daughter," Victoria said softly, "but I'd like to learn." Margaret's eyes welled with tears. "We can learn together." Behind them, the Pharmatech building stood as a monument to ambition unchecked by compassion. But on the wet pavement below, two women who had been shaped by its shadow began the delicate process of reclaiming their story. The aftermath of the Pharmatech board meeting reverberated through London's business community like aftershocks from an earthquake. In a small cafe in Notting Hill, far from the corporate towers of the financial district, Victoria sat across from Sarah Chen, watching the rain pattern the windows. "The story has gone international," Sarah said, showing Victoria her tablet. "Former Pharmatech victims are coming forward across Europe, but that's not why I asked you to meet." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs and documents from dozens of family-owned pharmacies that had been destroyed by Pharmatech's expansion. "These people want to rebuild. They're organizing, pooling resources, but they need guidance. They need someone who understands both worlds." Victoria studied the faces in the photographs, families standing proudly in front of their shops, just as her grandfather had done all those years ago. "You want me to help them? You have the knowledge, the experience, and now the motivation to make things right." The idea took root in Victoria's mind. She thought of her grandfather's first shop, of the community it had served, of the values it had represented. "It won't be easy. The industry has changed." "That's exactly why they need you," Sarah pressed. "You understand modern business practices, but now you also understand the importance of balance." Later that evening, Victoria visited Margaret's flat for dinner, their first proper meal together. The small kitchen was warm and fragrant with cooking smells. Victoria watched as her mother moved around the space, noting how she kept glancing at her, as if afraid she might disappear. "I found something today," Margaret said, pulling out an old album. "Your first steps were right there in the pharmacy. You used to play with the empty boxes, building castles behind the counter." Victoria traced the faded photographs with her finger. "Tell me about grandfather's first shop." Margaret's face lit up. It was more than just a business. Every customer had a name, a story. Your grandfather knew which elderly customers needed their prescriptions delivered, which families were struggling to afford medicine. He found ways to help, to make it work. And you continued that after him. I tried. It wasn't always easy, balancing the books with compassion. But we believed that business could be both profitable and humane. Victoria pulled out Sarah's folder. There are others who believe that too. They want to rebuild, but they need help adapting to today's market while preserving those values. Margaret studied the documents, her experienced eye catching details Victoria had missed. The landscape has changed, but the principles haven't. People still need personal care, community connection. They're tired of being treated like numbers. Over cups of tea, they began to plan. Victoria's corporate experience merged with Margaret's understanding of community pharmacy. They identified areas where independent pharmacies could thrive, ways to leverage technology while maintaining personal service, strategies to compete with chains through specialization and community engagement. "We could create a network," Victoria suggested, excitement building. Independent pharmacies supporting each other, sharing resources and knowledge, but each maintaining its unique identity and connection to its community. "A different kind of chain," Margaret mused. "One built on cooperation rather than conquest." The next morning, they convened a meeting in a community centre in South London, the room filled with former pharmacy owners, their children, and new entrepreneurs interested in ethical business. Victoria stood at the front, no longer the polished corporate executive, but something new, a bridge between two worlds. "We can't simply turn back the clock," she began, "but we can create something new, something that honors the past while embracing the future." She outlined their vision, a cooperative network of independent pharmacies, each locally owned and operated, but supported by shared resources, bulk purchasing power, and modern technology. The structure would ensure no single entity could gain too much control while providing the strength of unity. As she spoke, Victoria saw hope rekindling in eyes that had known only defeat. Questions and suggestions flew across the room. People who had lost everything to corporate expansion began to see a path forward. Margaret watched from the side, pride mixing with amazement as her daughter combined business acumen with genuine compassion. During a break, she pulled Victoria aside. "You remind me of your grandfather," she said softly. "He always said that the true measure of business success wasn't in the profits, but in the lives touched." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. "I wish I had known him. You're carrying on his legacy in ways he never could have imagined." Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the city. In the community center, people who had been competitors now sat together, planning a future built on cooperation rather than competition. It was a small beginning, but like all true changes, it started with people coming together, choosing to believe in something better. Alexander Blackwood sat in his private study, watching the sunset paint London's skyline in shades of amber. His tablet displayed news headlines about Pharmatech's plummeting stock prices and the growing momentum of Victoria's cooperative pharmacy movement. 3 weeks had passed since the board meeting, and his empire was showing cracks he'd never thought possible. "Sir," his assistant entered quietly, "the remaining board members have signed the papers. They're restructuring without you." Blackwood didn't turn from the window. "And our major shareholders, moving their investments to safer ventures. But there's something else." She hesitated. "Victoria Pierce is making waves. The Pharmacy Cooperative Network has already secured backing from ethical investment funds. They're targeting our key locations for their first wave of openings." Now he did turn, his face hardened with resolve. "Get me Oliver Spencer from Regulatory Affairs. It's time to remind everyone why Pharmatech became successful in the first place." Across town, in a renovated warehouse serving as the network's headquarters, Victoria led a strategy session with 24 former pharmacy owners. The space hummed with energy as people shared ideas and experiences. Maps and charts covered the walls, showing planned locations and community needs assessments. "The response has been overwhelming," Victoria explained, pointing to a digital display. "We've had over 300 applications from independent pharmacists wanting to join the network. Local communities are pledging support through crowdfunding initiatives." Margaret, who had become the heart of the movement, added, "And it's not just about medicine. People want the personal connection back. They're tired of being processed through corporate systems." The meeting was interrupted by Sarah Chen's arrival, her expression grave. "We have a problem. Blackwood's making moves behind the scenes. He's leveraging his connections in the regulatory board to challenge our licensing applications." Victoria felt her stomach tighten. She knew Blackwood's tactics all too well. She'd once helped implement them. "What exactly is he doing?" "Claiming our cooperative structure violates pharmaceutical distribution regulations. He's pushing for emergency reviews of all independent pharmacy licenses." Sarah pulled up documents on her tablet. "It's cleverly done. Technically legal, but designed to bury us in red tape and drain our resources." The room fell silent. Many there had faced similar tactics before, watching their family businesses crumble under regulatory pressure and legal fees. Victoria stood, her voice firm. "This is exactly what he expects, for us to feel overwhelmed and give up. But this time, we're not fighting alone." "Sarah, how many journalists are covering our story now?" "Dozens. The public loves the angle of community revival against corporate power. Plus, I've been documenting everything since Margaret's first confrontation." "Good. We'll need that transparency." Victoria turned to the group. "Everyone here has expertise we need. Former owners who understand local regulations, young pharmacists with fresh ideas, community leaders who know their neighborhood's needs. Together, we're stronger than any corporate strategy." They worked late into the night, developing contingency plans and support systems. When challenges arose in one area, others stepped in with solutions. It was a stark contrast to the cutthroat corporate world Victoria had known. The next morning, Victoria arrived at her mother's flat for their now regular breakfast meeting. She found Margaret examining old photographs, her expression thoughtful. "I found these in the attic," Margaret said, showing Victoria pictures of the original Walsh pharmacy. "Look at this one. Your grandfather helping a young mother with her sick child, staying open late because she couldn't leave work earlier." Victoria studied the image. "We're not just fighting for businesses, are we? We're fighting for these moments." That's what he never understood. Margaret replied softly. Success isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about creating spaces where these moments can happen. Victoria's phone buzzed. Another regulatory challenge had been filed. But as she looked at the photograph of her grandfather, something clicked. "Mum, where are all the old records from Walsh Pharmacies? The complete business files?" "In storage, I kept everything. Why?" "Because Blackwood's using the system against us. But if we can prove our model isn't new, that it's actually a return to established, previously approved practices." They spent the afternoon in a dusty storage unit, going through boxes of business records. What they found was extraordinary. Decades of documentation showing how independent pharmacies had once formed informal support networks, sharing resources while maintaining individual ownership. "This is it," Victoria breathed, examining the yellowed papers. "Legal precedent. Proof that our cooperative model isn't radical, it's restoration." As they drove back to the network headquarters, Victoria noticed a familiar car following them. "Blackwood's having us watched," she noted calmly. Margaret gripped the files tighter. He's scared. For the first time, he's facing something he can't control. People working together, instead of against each other. The sun was setting as they arrived at the warehouse. Inside, dozens of people were still working, planning, supporting each other. Victoria looked around at the community they'd built. Former competitors, now allies, young pharmacists learning from experienced owners, local residents offering insights about their neighborhood's needs. "We're not just rebuilding pharmacies," she realized. "We're rebuilding trust." The London business community buzzed with tension as two opposing forces gathered strength. In Pharmatech's former headquarters, now occupied by interim management, Blackwood held court with a select group of allies. The sleek boardroom that had once showcased his triumph now felt like a war room. "The regulatory challenges are just the beginning," he told his confidants. "Every independent pharmacy that joins their network creates a weakness we can exploit. One health code violation, one licensing issue, and the whole house of cards collapses." Oliver Spencer, his regulatory expert, nodded in agreement. "We've identified several potential pressure points. Their shared resource model leaves them vulnerable to supply chain disruption." "Then disrupt it," Blackwood commanded. "Show them why sentimentality has no place in modern business." Meanwhile, in a sunlit conference room at the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, Victoria and Margaret presented their case to the regulatory board. The room was packed with industry professionals, journalists, and community representatives. "The pharmacy cooperative network isn't just about business," Victoria explained, her voice steady. "It's about responsible healthcare delivery. Each member maintains individual ownership and accountability, while sharing resources to ensure better service and sustainability." She displayed the historical documents they'd discovered. "This model isn't new. For generations, independent pharmacies worked together while maintaining professional standards. We're simply updating that tradition for the modern age." Dr. Eleanor Matthews, head of the regulatory board, studied the documents with interest. "These records are quite compelling, Ms. Pierce, but Mr. Blackwood's team raises valid concerns about quality control across a decentralized network. That's why we've developed this." Victoria unveiled their comprehensive compliance system, combining traditional oversight with modern technology. Each member pharmacy maintains its independence while adhering to shared standards. "We're not sacrificing quality for community. We're enhancing both." As the presentation continued, Sarah Chen noticed a subtle shift in the room. Board members who had seemed skeptical began asking engaged questions. Community representatives shared stories of how local pharmacies had once been lifelines for their neighborhoods. The meeting was interrupted by urgent news. Supply companies were suddenly canceling contracts with network members, citing restructuring requirements. "Blackwood," Victoria muttered, recognizing his tactics. But before the setback could sink in, something unexpected happened. James Richardson stood up from the audience. "If I may, I have something relevant to share." He approached the board, carrying a thick folder. "These are internal Pharmatech documents showing systematic manipulation of supply chains to destroy competition. I kept them as insurance, but now they serve a better purpose." The evidence was damning. What Blackwood had presented as market forces was revealed as calculated sabotage. The regulatory board members exchanged concerned glances. Dr. Matthews cleared her throat. This goes beyond our immediate licensing discussion. These documents suggest serious anti-competitive practices. Victoria seized the moment. The network isn't just a business model, it's a solution to these very practices. By working together, independent pharmacies can resist corporate manipulation while maintaining professional standards. Outside the meeting, London's late autumn rain fell steadily. News crews gathered, sensing the story's significance. Inside, the debate continued, but the tone had shifted. The network's model wasn't just being evaluated, it was being seen as a potential blueprint for ethical business reform. That evening, in Margaret's flat, Victoria found her mother sorting through more old business records. "What are you looking for?" "Connections," Margaret replied. "All these years I thought I was alone in what happened to my business. But looking through these records, I can see patterns. Other family pharmacies reaching out, trying to help each other. We were stronger together even then. We just didn't realize it in time." Victoria's phone lit up with messages from network members. Despite Blackwood's pressure, new applications kept coming in. Communities were organizing support funds. Former Pharmatech employees were offering insider knowledge to help counter corporate tactics. "He still doesn't understand," Victoria said, watching the messages flow in. "Every attack makes us stronger, because it proves exactly why we're necessary." Margaret touched her daughter's hand. "You've created something he can't fight in his usual way. He knows how to break individuals, but he's never faced united communities." As night fell over London, two visions of the future faced off. In his luxury apartment, Blackwood plotted with his remaining allies, still believing in the power of corporate might. In homes and community centers across the city, people gathered to protect what they valued, not just businesses, but the human connections they represented. The regulatory board's decision was scheduled for the following week, but something bigger than licenses and regulations was at stake. It was a battle between two philosophies, one that saw business as a tool for dominance and another that saw it as a means of community service. Victoria stood at her mother's window, watching the city lights flicker through the rain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in her life, she knew exactly which side she was fighting for. The morning of the regulatory board's decision dawned grey and cold over London. Victoria stood in front of her wardrobe, hesitating between her usual corporate attire and something simpler. She finally chose a modest blue suit, a bridge between her past and present, just like herself. Her phone buzzed with an unexpected message. "Meet me at the old Walsh Pharmacy location. Important. Alexander Blackwood." Victoria showed the message to Margaret over breakfast. "He's planning something." "Of course he is," Margaret replied, stirring her tea. "The question is, do we play his game?" The original Walsh Pharmacy building stood on a corner in South London, now a vacant storefront with faded signs. Victoria arrived to find Blackwood already there, looking out of place in his expensive coat. "Hello, Victoria," he said, turning to face her. "Appropriate location, don't you think? Where everything began. What do you want, Alexander?" He gestured to the empty shop. "Look at this place. Obsolete. Inefficient. A relic of the past, just like your cooperative fantasy." He pulled out his phone, showing her a document. "I've acquired controlling interest in the property management company that owns most of your proposed network locations. One word from me, and your entire initiative collapses." Victoria studied his face. The man who had shaped her life, taught her everything she knew about business. "You still think this is about properties and contracts? Everything is about leverage, Victoria. I taught you that." "No," she corrected him. "You taught me that business is warfare, but you were wrong. Business is community, connection, service." "Pretty words," he scoffed, "but reality is harder. You think these little family pharmacies can survive in today's market? You think sentiment pays the bills?" Victoria pulled out her tablet, showing him the network's financial projections. "Actually, yes. Our model isn't just ethically sound, it's profitable. When businesses support each other instead of trying to destroy each other, everyone benefits, including customers." "Then you leave me no choice." He sent a message on his phone. "I've just instructed my property managers to terminate all potential leases with network members. Good luck building your community without physical locations." Victoria smiled, surprising him. "I wondered when you'd play that card. That's why we approached ethical investment funds last week. They've already purchased those properties. The paperwork was finalized this morning. Blackwood's composure cracked. Impossible. I had exclusive rights. To the management company, yes, but we went straight to the property owners. Turns out, when you present people with a choice between corporate control and community revival, many choose community. As if on cue, a group of people rounded the corner. Network members, local residents, journalists. Sarah Chen was among them, her camera crew capturing everything. "What is this?" Blackwood demanded. "This," Victoria gestured to the crowd, "is community. All these people are here because they believe in something bigger than profit margins. They believe in connection, in service, in building something together instead of tearing each other down." Margaret stepped forward from the group. "Alexander, you spent your life fighting against what you saw as weakness. But looking after each other isn't weakness, it's strength." Blackwood looked around at the gathered faces, seeing not the faceless masses he'd always dismissed, but individuals with stories, with purpose. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of what he'd sacrificed in his pursuit of power. "The regulatory board meets in 2 hours," Victoria continued. "They'll decide between two visions of the future. One where business serves communities and one where it exploits them. You can keep fighting us, Alexander, or you can finally learn what my grandfather knew. True success isn't measured in market share." The crowd had grown larger. People from neighboring shops came out to watch. A young mother with a child, an elderly man leaning on his cane. The very people Blackwood had always seen as mere consumers, now standing together as a community. He straightened his coat, his mask of confidence slipping back into place. "You're making a mistake, Victoria. The market isn't kind to idealists." "Maybe," she agreed, "but I'd rather fail trying to build something meaningful than succeed by destroying what others have built." As Blackwood walked away, his expensive shoes clicking on the pavement, Victoria turned to the gathered crowd. The old Walsh Pharmacy building stood behind her, its faded facade a testament to what had been lost and what could be rebuilt. Sarah Chen approached with her microphone. "Care to make a statement about today's regulatory hearing?" Victoria looked at her mother, then at the community gathered around them. "Just this. Business isn't just about transactions, it's about relationships, and it's time we remembered that." The crowd began to disperse, heading toward the regulatory board building. Victoria lingered for a moment, touching the old pharmacy's window. Through the dusty glass, she could almost see the ghosts of the past. Her grandfather serving customers, her mother keeping books, herself as a toddler playing behind the counter. "Ready?" Margaret asked softly. Victoria nodded. Ready to build something new, something that honors the past while looking to the future. Together, they joined the stream of people walking toward the hearing that would decide not just their fate, but the fate of community pharmacy across Britain. The morning fog had begun to lift, revealing glimpses of blue sky above London's towers. The regulatory board hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Television screens had been set up in overflow rooms throughout the building, where hundreds more watched the proceedings. The air crackled with anticipation as Dr. Eleanor Matthews called the session to order. "Today's hearing will determine the licensing framework for the proposed pharmacy cooperative network," she announced. "We'll hear final arguments from both sides before reaching our decision." Blackwood's legal team presented first, armed with charts and graphs showing potential risks of the cooperative model. Their arguments were technical, focused on regulatory compliance and standardization challenges. Then it was Victoria's turn. She stood before the board, feeling the weight of countless hopes resting on her shoulders. But instead of beginning with business projections, she started with a story. "When I was 3 years old," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I played with empty medicine boxes in my grandfather's pharmacy. I didn't know then that those moments would be some of my last in that store. I didn't understand why my mother had to give me up, or why our family business had to close." She paused, looking directly at the board members. "But now, I understand something else. What was lost wasn't just a business. It was a way of caring for communities. Every independent pharmacy that closed left a hole that corporate efficiency couldn't fill." Screens behind her lit up with images, historical photos of family pharmacies, contemporary shots of community support rallies, charts showing the network's innovative compliance systems. "Our model combines the best of both worlds," she continued. modern efficiency with traditional service, corporate resources with personal care, but most importantly, it puts healthcare back in the hands of healthcare professionals who know their communities. Margaret stepped forward next, presenting the historical documentation they'd discovered. These records show how independent pharmacies have always worked together informally. We're simply formalizing those connections for the modern age. As the morning progressed, community members testified about the impact of losing their local pharmacies. Healthcare professionals spoke about the advantages of personal relationships with patients. Former Pharmatech employees revealed how corporate policies had often conflicted with patient care. During a brief recess, Victoria found herself face to face with Blackwood in the hallway. He looked tired, the fight gradually leaving his eyes. "You really believe in this, don't you?" he asked quietly. "I believe in balance," she replied. "Something you taught me, actually, just not in the way you intended." He studied her for a long moment. "You know, when I first saw you as a child, I thought I could shape you into the perfect corporate successor, someone who understood that sentiment was weakness. And instead you've become something else entirely. Something," he hesitated, "something stronger perhaps than what I tried to create." Before Victoria could respond, they were called back into the hearing room. Dr. Matthews stood to deliver the board's decision. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, this board recognizes that healthcare delivery must balance efficiency with humanity. The pharmacy cooperative networks model, while innovative, is grounded in established practices and provides robust quality controls while preserving community connection. She paused, looking around the room. "Therefore, we approve the network's licensing framework with regular reviews to ensure maintained standards. Furthermore, we recommend this model be considered a template for future healthcare business structures." The room erupted in cheers. Victoria felt her mother's hand grip hers tightly. Across the room, Sarah Chen was already broadcasting the historic decision to a national audience. But Victoria's attention was drawn to Blackwood, standing alone by the door. Their eyes met across the crowded room. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked away, not in defeat, but perhaps in recognition that the world he'd tried to create was giving way to something new. Outside, the autumn sun had broken through the clouds, bathing London in warm light. Network members and supporters gathered on the building's steps, celebrating not just a victory, but the beginning of a new chapter in community healthcare. Margaret hugged her daughter tightly. "Your grandfather would be so proud." Victoria looked out at the crowd, pharmacists, community members, journalists, all part of this moment of change. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" "Yes," Margaret smiled. "Now comes the real work, bringing it all to life." As the celebration continued around them, Victoria thought about the journey that had brought them here. From the little girl playing with medicine boxes to the corporate executive she'd become, and now to something new, someone who could bridge worlds, build connections, heal not just bodies, but communities. The old Walsh Pharmacy building would soon reopen, the first of many network locations. But it would be more than just a pharmacy. It would be a symbol of what business could be when profit and purpose worked together, when communities chose connection over competition. London's skyline stretched before them, its mix of historic buildings and modern towers, a reminder that the best futures were built on foundations of the past. In the crowd, Victoria could see the faces of those who had believed in this vision, who had fought for it, who had chosen to build something together rather than tear each other apart. It was time to begin again. Spring blossomed in London, bringing with it a sense of renewal. The original Walsh Pharmacy building, now restored to its former glory, gleamed in the morning sun. The traditional green cross above the door had been relit, and the windows displayed a perfect blend of modern efficiency and old-world charm. Victoria stood before the building, adjusting the ribbon that would soon be cut in the grand reopening ceremony. 6 months had passed since the regulatory board's decision, and the pharmacy cooperative network had exceeded all expectations. 37 locations were now operational across Britain, with dozens more in development. "Everything ready." Margaret appeared beside her, carrying a box of old photographs, almost the display cases. All set up inside, a timeline of the Walsh Pharmacy through the years, right up to today. They entered the shop together. The interior had been carefully designed to honor the past while embracing the future. Modern dispensing equipment sat alongside restored wooden cabinets. Digital screens displaying health information were framed in vintage pharmaceutical advertisements. The consulting room, once her grandfather's office, now featured state-of-the-art telemedicine capabilities. Sarah Chen arrived early with her camera crew, preparing to document the reopening. "You've seen the latest polls?" she asked Victoria. Public trust in community pharmacies is at an all-time high. The network's model is being studied by healthcare organizations worldwide. Victoria nodded, but her attention was drawn to a young mother entering the shop, carrying a toddler with a fever. Without hesitation, Margaret stepped forward to help, guiding them to the consulting room. Some things hadn't changed and never should. The crowd gathering outside included network members, local residents, and healthcare professionals. James Richardson arrived with a group of former Pharmatech employees who had joined the cooperative movement. Even Dr. Matthews from the regulatory board had come to show her support. As Victoria prepared to address the gathering, she noticed a familiar figure standing at the back of the crowd. Alexander Blackwood, looking somewhat diminished in a simple suit, watched the proceedings with an unreadable expression. "Welcome, everyone," Victoria began, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "Today isn't just about reopening a pharmacy, it's about rekindling a tradition of community care that nearly vanished from our society." She gestured to the building behind her. "My grandfather opened this pharmacy, believing that business could be both profitable and compassionate. My mother carried on that belief, even when it seemed impossible. Today, we're proving they were right." The network's first quarterly report was projected onto a screen. Profitable operations, high patient satisfaction scores, improved health outcomes in communities served. But more telling were the personal stories. Elderly patients receiving regular home visits, young families getting personalized care, local health initiatives supported by network pharmacies. "We're creating something that can't be measured in purely financial terms," Victoria continued. "Every network pharmacy is independently owned and operated, but together we're stronger than any corporate chain. We share resources, knowledge, and a commitment to putting people before profits." Margaret stepped forward to share her own words. 25 years ago, I thought I'd lost everything. My business, my daughter, my purpose. Today I'm standing here watching a new generation carry forward our family's legacy in ways we never imagined possible." The ribbon-cutting ceremony was followed by tours of the renovated pharmacy. Victoria noticed Blackwood lingering, examining the historical display. She approached him quietly. "Thank you for coming," she said. He touched a photograph of the original pharmacy. "You know, I never understood your grandfather's way of doing business. I thought small meant weak, limited." He turned to face her. "I was wrong. You taught me valuable lessons too," Victoria replied. "About efficiency, about systems, about thinking bigger. I just had to learn to apply them differently." As Blackwood left, Victoria saw him pause to watch Margaret helping another customer, giving the same personal attention that had characterized Walsh pharmacies for generations. Something like recognition crossed his face, perhaps understanding at last what he had spent his life fighting against. Inside the pharmacy, the day continued with a steady stream of customers, old and new. Victoria watched as her mother moved through the space with natural grace, her professional expertise enhanced rather than replaced by modern technology. A young pharmacist who had joined the network approached Victoria with questions about their patient care protocols. As they discussed the balance between efficiency and personal attention, Victoria realized they weren't just running pharmacies. They were training the next generation to carry forward this renewed vision of community healthcare. The afternoon sun cast warm light through the restored Victorian windows, illuminating the space where 3 generations of her family had now served their community. On the wall, a new plaque hung beside her grandfather's original pharmacy license, the Walsh Pharmacy, where tradition meets tomorrow. 1 year after the Walsh Pharmacy's reopening, Victoria sat in her mother's kitchen, sharing their Sunday morning ritual of tea and conversation. Family photographs now covered the walls. Not just old ones, but new memories they'd created together over the past 18 months. "The network's first annual conference is next week," Victoria said, adding milk to her tea. "Over 200 members now. Did you finish your keynote speech?" Margaret smiled, pulling out her notes. "Almost. I keep thinking about how much has changed. Not just the business, but us, everything. The conference would bring together network members from across Britain, celebrating their successful first year and planning for the future. But more than that, it would showcase a new way of doing business, one that had caught the attention of healthcare providers worldwide. Victoria's phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Chen. The documentary she'd been filming about the network's journey was ready for its premiere. They'd called it The Community Prescription, telling the story not just of the Walsh family, but of all the communities touched by their movement. "Have you seen this?" Margaret held up the morning paper. A small article announced Alexander Blackwood's latest venture, a foundation supporting small business development in underserved communities. His quote mentioned, "learning valuable lessons about the true meaning of success." Victoria read the article thoughtfully. People can change. Sometimes they just need to see a different way is possible. They drove to the pharmacy together, as they often did on Sundays. The shop was closed for business, but hummed with activity as network members gathered for a training session on new community health initiatives. In the consulting room, now named after her grandfather, Victoria watched as experienced pharmacists shared knowledge with newer members. The network's strength had always been this combination of experience and innovation, tradition and progress. A young pharmacist raised her hand during the session. "How do we maintain this personal approach as we grow larger? Won't we face the same pressures that led other businesses to prioritize profits over people?" Victoria stepped forward. "That's why our structure is different. Every pharmacy remains independently owned and rooted in its community. We share resources and support, but never control. Growth doesn't mean losing our soul. It means spreading our values." Later, in the dispensary, Margaret showed a group of students the original ledgers from Walsh Pharmacy, preserved as a reminder of their heritage. "Look at these notes my father made about his patients, their families, their needs, their stories. That's what we're preserving, just with modern tools." The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass panels they'd restored, casting colorful patterns across the floor. Victoria found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them here, from corporate towers to community corners, from profit margins to personal care. "You're quiet," Margaret observed as they closed up the pharmacy. "Just thinking about grandfather's old saying, the one you told me about. Medicine heals the body, but care heals the soul." They walked together through the neighborhood that had supported their vision of change. Shopkeepers waved, children played in the park, elderly residents stopped to chat. This wasn't just a business district, it was a community alive and thriving. At a cafe table outside the pharmacy, mother and daughter sat watching the sunset paint the London sky. Victoria reached into her bag and pulled out a small wrapped package. "I found this in the old storage boxes," she said, handing it to Margaret. Inside was a faded photograph of Margaret holding 3-year-old Victoria behind the original pharmacy counter, both laughing at something long forgotten. The picture had been taken just weeks before everything fell apart. "But look at us now," Margaret said softly, touching the photograph. "Sometimes the longest journeys bring us right back home, just with new eyes and fuller hearts." Victoria looked at their reflection in the pharmacy window, mother and daughter, past and present, all the broken pieces finally made whole. The green cross above the door glowed softly as evening settled over London, a beacon of hope and healing for the community it served. Inside the pharmacy, the old photographs hung alongside new ones, telling a story of loss and recovery, of corporate power yielding to community strength, of a family torn apart and reunited. But more than that, they told a story of transformation, how the worst moments in life could lead to the most beautiful changes if one was brave enough to learn, to grow, to believe in something bigger than oneself. The last light of day faded from the sky, but the pharmacy's windows glowed warm and welcoming, just as they had in her grandfather's time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to prove that business could be both profitable and humane. But for now, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Mother and daughter sat together in the gathering dusk, their tea growing cold, sharing the comfortable silence of those who had found their way home at last.